I'll introduce myself as well. So I'm Rain Sherlock and I am the head of evaluation here at TASO and joined today by my colleague Luke, who's one of the research officers in our research and evaluation team at TASO. I'm going to be chairing today's session, so obviously welcoming you all now, but I am then going to hand over to Luke for the kind of main bulk of the presentation and of the webinar today. And Luke will talk you through principles for developing and creating engaging charts for about 40 minutes or so. And then, as I mentioned, for anyone who's just joined, we'll kind of pause towards the end of the webinar and make sure we keep some time for questions. So do drop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen as and when they arise, as you're listening to Luke present. It's about 3 minutes past and we've got quite a lot of content to get through, so I think I will kick us off there. This session is being recorded. Hopefully you got a little kind of automated voice telling you that it's being recorded when you joined. And we'll circulate that recording for everyone who signed up to today's webinar. And we will also archive it or publish it on our website, so it will be available for everyone to access after the session as well. So over to you, Luke, to talk us through exactly what you're going to cover today.
Thank you, Rain. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'll dive in with an overview of the session today. So we're going to kick off by talking about the power of data viz, why I think good data viz is important. We're then going to link it to the APP context specifically, thinking about why it's relevant for producing and disseminating APPs. I'll talk a bit about why it's important to tailor data viz to your specific audience, thinking about what the intention is behind the chart. And then I'll introduce you to the principles of good data visualization that are set out in our newly released interactive data visualization style guide. And as Rain said, we'll leave some space for Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to dive in with a scenario posed by Jonathan Schwabish that will probably feel familiar to a lot of people, which is that in the research process, we often spend months or even years sometimes gathering data and writing up our findings in something like this. And when we're collecting that data and analyzing it, we're really diligent. We spend lots of time on it. You edit, you draft, you redraft. And then when it comes to the end of the process, we often drop in a chart right at the end that uses a lot of the default settings. It's sort of, sometimes it's like a tick box where you've done all of the rest of the steps and then you produce your chart. Maybe you add some brand colors to it, but you don't think too much beyond that. But I think this is missing a major opportunity. John Byrne-Murdoch of the Financial Times has this great framing that I like about something moving from a chart to a piece of communication. So by putting some extra effort and extra time into producing charts, as you do with your writing, your analysis, there's an opportunity to really create engagement, expand your audience, and communicate the key takeaways from your analysis to a wider group of people in a way that's going to really impact them and stick with them in a way that it might not if you just go with those default settings. So I'm going to start with an example of this that hopefully shows you how moving from a chart to a piece of communication makes things more accessible, particularly for non-experts. So here I've got a chart from an academic paper that looks at graduate wage premiums over time. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this chart. And in fact, academic papers are quite limited in what you can do with how you visualize something. So this might be suitable for that academic paper. But the audience for something like this is going to be inherently limited. So if I went off the slide, I don't know how many of you would be able to tell me what the key takeaway is from that data that was just presented to you. I know I certainly wouldn't have been able to if I saw that chart that quickly. Whereas something like this, which is the same data presented in a different way, that key takeaway is immediately obvious, and it makes that underlying data more understandable, more accessible for a non-expert audience. So anyone can look at this chart on the right and understand what's going on. And it should hopefully facilitate more exploration of that underlying data as well. Someone can see what their key takeaway is, and then they can see the data in front of them and think, well, does that line up with what they're saying? Is the data I'm seeing line up with what the key takeaway is? Maybe I want to go away and explore that in some more detail. And developing your charts like this, spending that extra time on improving them, has the potential to really drive engagement to a large extent. So here again is a chart tracking COVID over time. And this is something that you would produce using a lot of those default settings. And this is often where we stop in the process. We create something like this, and then you send that out into the world because it's got all the information in there, all the data is there. You're not misleading anyone, but it's not likely to create a huge amount of engagement. It's not immediately obvious what your key takeaway from something like this should be. Whereas this chart on the right really brings home those key findings. It brings the data to life in an engaging way, to such an extent that this piece went on to be the most viewed piece on the Financial Times website in their history. Which I think really illustrates the power that putting that extra effort in to communicate those key takeaways, how far that can go and how that can really elevate people's engagement with the piece, and make that data interesting and available to a much wider group of people who maybe aren't familiar with the subject. So how does this link to APPs? For anyone who doesn't know on the call, Access and Participation Plans set out how higher education providers are going to improve equality of opportunity for disadvantaged students in higher education. Now, in the guidance for APPs around summarising the risks to equality of opportunity and plans to address those, there's a line that explicitly highlights that a provider can use charts and graphs to aid communication. And when it comes to the guidance for the summary, there's a line in there that it's supposed to be accessible to non-expert readers, and that this can be done using a wide range of formats and media. So hopefully you can see the link there that I have, that two of the primary purposes of developing your charts like this are to aid communication and to widen your audience. So I think there's a clear link here between APPs and making better charts. You can really get people to engage with what you've produced in a different way, and make it interesting to a much wider audience. So whether that's students, internal stakeholders, or posting it through like a blog or a conference with someone who's not familiar with it, charts are a really valuable tool for communicating complex data in an interesting way where people who aren't as familiar with it are going to be able to understand it and then potentially take action off the back of it. So I think there's a few ways that we could apply this to specific bits of APPs. Two that jumped to mind were illustrating disparities. So I think showing those gaps, we can think about that move from a chart to a piece of communication. So something like this, where you're showing ethnicity degree awarding gaps. I think all the data's there in the chart on the left, and someone who's familiar with that idea is going to be able to look at it and see what's going on. They'll see that the proportion is higher for white students and Black and minority ethnic students. But if you're less familiar with the data, it might not be immediately obvious what your key takeaway should be from seeing something like this. And the chart on the right, it just brings those key highlights that you would presumably highlight through your text and through your analysis, bringing those to the fore in a visual way so that people are more likely to engage with it. Similarly, I think a promising area is for setting and tracking objectives. So here we see a chart that's just looking at the proportion of students entering the university who are eligible for free school meals, looking at the historical data and then the target data. It's quite simple data, but I think the the chart on the right just brings that conclusion that you're hoping people take away from the chart right to the front, makes it much more apparent that we're aiming to go from 5% to 8%. Here's the historical data, and here's the target. That said, the aim today isn't to be prescriptive. There's never going to be one single right way to make a chart. I'm sure there'll be bits of the charts you'll see today where you'd say, oh, I would have added that bit, I would have taken out that bit. Good data viz is somewhere between an art and a science. So there's principles that are likely going to take you a long way, but there's always going to be a lot of subjective components to it. So what I'm not going to do is say you should make this chart in this exact way and this chart in that exact way. Rather, my hope is that you'll be able to take away these principles and then apply them in your own context. So that might be improving the charts in the APP itself. I know that given time and resource constraints, that's often not going to be feasible, but it might be possible to go away and apply them for how you're presenting about your APP at conferences, in webinars, or in blogs. So I think even if you feel like there's limited scope for you to change your APP itself, or indeed if you've already submitted to it, there's still opportunities here for the charts to communicate to people what you're trying to get across in your APP, and make all of that work and that data analysis accessible to people. So when you're creating a chart, it's important to think about who your audience is and what the outcome is from including the chart. So I think whenever you're including the chart, it's helpful to take a step back and think, why are you including that chart? What kind of understanding are you aiming to facilitate? So are you trying to convey a key takeaway? Is there something in the text that you're trying to make stand out to people by representing it visually? Or are you trying to let people come to their own conclusions and bring their own expertise to it and analyze it for themselves? Andy Kirk, data visualization expert, has a really useful framing for this, of making charts either exhibitory, exploratory, or explanatory. So if I talk these through one by one, an exhibitory chart is what I think we can think of as the default. So here I'll go through these examples, again, using this ethnicity degree awarding gap example. We'll look at what this looks like in exhibitory, exploratory, and explanatory terms. So exhibitory, this is using those default settings. This is the most common type of chart you'll see. This is the typical, I think, in a report or an academic paper. But with something like this, the viewers have to do the work. So they're going to be most effective when you're targeting a specific audience who have a really solid understanding of the domain and the full context of the analysis. So something like this might be appropriate in a report where you've got the full context of the analysis surrounding the chart. But even then, I would argue that in a lot of cases, you're going to see a lot of benefit by moving from exhibitory to explanatory and making those key takeaways really jump out to people. The next option is exploratory. So this is the same data represented on the OFS dashboard. Now, I think this is a really good example of where exploratory is valuable. Exploratory or interactive charts are best when you're looking for viewers to make their own interpretations. Again, you're not giving them any assistance to take away the meaning. You're just putting the data out there with things like filters and buttons for people to go and explore it themselves. And this is particularly valuable when your audience is really well equipped with some time on their hands to go and explore and analyze the data themselves. But for someone who's not familiar at all with the context, this isn't going to do a lot for them. So for higher education providers who want to go and explore that data, this is appropriate for people to go and take it away. But for a student, say, who's looking to examine these gaps, who's not familiar with the context, this isn't going to be very helpful for them interpreting what they're being shown. And this is where explanatory comes in. So I think explanatory charts are where there's the biggest gap in terms of the greatest gains to be made. I don't think you see these very often in the sector or more broadly, but I think explanatory charts, they help readers to understand what's being presented to them quickly. So you can look at something like this and you get that key takeaway straight away. And this is done by directing the reader's attention towards the key information. So this doesn't mean excluding information. The data's still there and people can explore it to an extent, but you're just directing people's attention towards the data that you think is most relevant here. So a good way of thinking about this from Andy Kirk is thinking about how you would explain a chart verbally to someone. So if we go back to this exhibitory one, if you're walking someone through what your key takeaways were, you might say, look, the line for white students is higher than Black and minority ethnic students, and the line for Black students is lower than the rest. And what we think this is we're showing that there's a 20 percentage point gap here in 2021-22, and we want to emphasize that that's the gap between white students and Black and minority ethnic students. And in this example, we're just bringing all of that information into the chart in the same way that we would if we were verbally explaining that other chart. So there's key takeaways that you might not get without that verbal explanation or the full context around it. It's all contained within that chart. So people are going to be able to look at this and fully understand what's going on. So I think we're going to pause here for a quick poll on what tools you use for creating your charts.
We are, thank you, Luke. So I'm just launching a poll on screen, which hopefully will just pop up for each of you on your local screens, and it should have response options. You can just tick whichever of those response options apply to you in your context. I can see lots of responses coming in. So the question asks, which tool do you currently prefer for creating charts? We've got Excel in the lead, but also with other, interestingly, as a second highest option. So we've got, at the moment, approximately 84% of people saying that they frequently use Excel or that it's their preferred software. Very intrigued about the other. I wish a poll allowed for free text responses.
I think our follow-up survey that will go out after this will have an open text button where people can let us know what other tool they use that we haven't captured yet.
That would be great, and feel free to also drop your drop the kind of software or tools that you use in the chat, because it makes me think we could produce additional and useful guidance. The responses have kind of plateaued and stopped flowing in, so I'm going to end the poll there and hand back to you, Luke. But it looks like Excel's in the lead.
Thank you. So I think it's worth noting off the back of that in the data viz guide that I'm going to introduce later, we've designed it to be tool ambiguous, tool friendly. So whatever tool you use, you should be able to apply those principles. And in the examples that I'm going to walk through now, it's a mixture of R and Excel I've used to make these. So hopefully these will be accessible, whatever your tool of choice is, whatever the mystery other choice that half the people are using is. So I'm going to dive into these principles. So in our guide, we set out 5 key principles that you can use for creating engaging and impactful charts. And these are adapted from the work of Jonathan Schwabish primarily, and some other sources brought in there. And I think if you keep these in mind, you'll hopefully be able to create more engaging, interesting charts. So I'll kick us off with reduce the clutter. So we can see a chart like this. I think about how we can strip it back to basic elements and simplify it really to make information more visible to people. Because I think something like this, you've got things like the use of color that are not adding value necessarily, not facilitating understanding. And if we strip back some of that information by being selective with which bits we use, you're going to bring other information more, make it more prominent. So here I've taken away the use of color in the chart on the left because it's not really adding anything by having those different categories, different colors. Taken away the X and Y axes, which you don't always want to do, but in this case, it's pretty self-evident that these are categories, and we've got that this is the proportion of students from our formal statistical subtitle here. And there's a couple of other small touches like stripping back the number of grid lines and thinking about how many grid lines you need to enable the kind of understanding that you're looking for. Particularly here, things like the horizontal grid lines aren't going to be adding anything for this horizontal bar chart. The next principle is to annotate. So this is thinking about where adding text to your chart carefully and selectively can help further that telling the story of the data. So in particular, this is going to be helpful where you're highlighting key bits of information or adding context. So if there's any outliers or peaks or troughs. So here we have a case where we see a big peak in 2019-20. Now to a lot of people, it's going to immediately jump out what's going on here, why we're seeing that peak. But again, to a non-expert, someone who's not very familiar, they might think, oh, what happened in 2019-20? Was there a significant change to the program, to entry requirements that changed this? So we can just add a simple annotation like this that gives us that extra bit of context that says, here we're attributing this temporary peak to disruption from COVID-19. And I think this is something that you would presumably spell out in the text of your analysis. So I think it's important that you bring that onto a chart, because otherwise I think you can risk people going away and looking at something like this and saying, oh, what happened in that peak? We must have done something right that year. So that annotation just helps you focus in on those peaks, troughs, outliers, and explain what's going on. The next principle is to integrate the text. So in particular, this means active titles, so titles that convey the key takeaway, and integrating the legend as well. So by having a title that tells you what the key takeaway is, it makes it easier for people to navigate the chart because they know what they're looking for. So here that looks something like this. If the key takeaway in your text and your purpose for including this chart is to highlight the increasing proportion of students with a mental health condition, including this as a title is going to go a long way for helping people understand what they're looking at on the chart. If you're looking at the chart on the left, you might just see a selection of lines and think, well, what am I supposed to be taking away from this? Why is it being included? So again, I think this speaks to the importance of what we talked about with considering why you're including a chart. If there's not a key takeaway, think about whether a chart is the best thing to include. Sometimes you don't always have to have one key takeaway, but if you can't think of a good reason why you're including a chart that you would want to highlight through a title, maybe it's not necessary to include a chart. And on integrating the legend, this just means instead of someone having to match up the color of the line to the legend, it's directly labeled. And this is particularly important where lines are crossing over at multiple points, or if the colors aren't very distinct. For accessibility purposes as well, directly labeling lines can be really helpful. So something like this just makes it easier for people to navigate those different lines. Their eyes aren't darting back and forth between the plot and the legend. It lets people focus in on the data. Another key one is to show the data. So to think about how you can highlight bits of data that you're really hoping that the reader's going to come away with. And you do this by changing selected properties of the chart in order to guide a reader's attention towards what you think is important. So in this case, where we're showing an increase in proportion of students with a mental health condition, we can highlight it like this. So you're using color and you're highlighting that line in the chart to make that association really obvious. So anyone looks at this at a glance, they see that increase in line. But importantly, you're still including that context as well. The other lines are still there for people to use as comparison points, but you're just bringing people's attention to what you think the key takeaway is. And of course, all of this is in service of making your chart as engaging as possible to get your audience on board and communicate that understanding. Because capturing a reader's attention like this is going to ensure that your message is not only seen, but that they're going to fully comprehend it and get a different level of understanding that they might not get from a simple chart, and they're going to take it away and remember it. You can drop a chart like this in whatever context, and it's going to make sense to people. They're going to get that key takeaway. And of course, as George Orwell says in his Principles for Good Writing, break any of these rules or principles in this case sooner than do anything ridiculous. So these aren't going to be things that you apply 100% of the time. As I say, it's somewhere between an art and a science. So if you don't feel like it's appropriate to highlight your data because you're not really sure what the key takeaway is, or if it doesn't feel practical to integrate the legend, you don't have to do it. You want to think about your context and treat these as useful rules of thumb rather than hard and fast rules that you should be applying every single time. So I've got a couple of worked examples here where we can see what it looks like when you apply those principles step by step. Although I will note that you don't have to go in that specific order we've set out. It's going to, again, change depending on what kind of chart you're making. So here we have something that you might see in an APP where we're showing the proportion of students from a deprived IND decile at the hypothetical TESO University compared to the wider sector. So our first step is going to be to reduce the clutter with stripping back some of those grid lines, stripping back the data labels, which is not to say we can't add them back in. We're just stripping things back. So we're thinking about what the essential elements are of the chart that we want to include. And again, you'll see I've dropped those axis titles here because I feel that's communicated through our title. Next step is to integrate the text. So here we're integrating the legend. Again, not only are you saving a bit of that horizontal space by directly labeling the lines, you're just stopping people's eyes going from left to right, and it's easier to follow those two lines. And of course, we also added the active title here. So our title is just bringing home what our key takeaway is, and maybe something that we might write as a key takeaway in our full text, which that we're looking to highlight that the gap in the proportion of deprived students against the sector is narrowing. So now you read that title, you know what you're looking for in the chart, and then you can go and verify it for yourself. And our final step is to annotate and show the data. So I think in this example, because it's just 2 lines, there's not loads we need to do in terms of highlighting specific bits. But you might want to do something like this. If the key focus is on, look, we're going from a 17 percentage point gap to a 10 percentage point gap, make that stand out through that selective and careful use of annotations on your chart. And hopefully this is a big difference going from the chart on the left to the chart on the right in terms of being engaging, stimulating conversation, and making those key takeaways really obvious to people. So someone who's a non-expert, or perhaps someone with limited time who doesn't have the time to think about what the full implications are and explore the detail in depth, can see what the key takeaway from you, the trusted researcher or evaluation staff, what you think the key takeaway is. You're making that really obvious to people. And another example here, which I flashed up briefly at the start, showing the proportion of students entering university who are eligible for free school meals. So here we're looking at setting and tracking objectives. So our first step, again, is going to be to reduce the clutter. I also mentioned, you'll notice here that I've selectively used a different color background, and I'm using those familiar TESO colors. I think this is more of an aesthetic touch, but I think it can help to make your charts more distinctive and stand out and look less like they've been put together using the default settings in Excel or R, and bring home that sort of brand association as well. So after we've reduced the clutter, the next thing we're going to do here is show the data. So in this case, I think the key thing to highlight is that we've got past data and future data targets. So we want to make that really clear that we've got two distinct bits that we're looking at here. So that jumps out to people. Then we're going to annotate. So here I've just added that this is historical data, this is target data, just to make that even more clear. And I've also added that we're going from 5% to 8%. So I think these might be the two key numbers that you might highlight in your text. So we're just going to add those onto the chart so people know what they're looking at. They know, right, we're going from 5% to 8%. And just going to bring that home with a title as well that conveys that key takeaway. If you were summarizing your takeaways and bullet points, this might be what your bullet point would look like. So you just add that onto the chart. People know what your aim is here. And I think this chart on the right is going to be a more compelling, memorable bit of information. I think you're more likely to look at the chart on the right and remember that you're aiming to go from 5% to 8% than you are in the chart on the left, which is where we started from. So how can you apply these principles? Well, I am going to introduce you to TESO's new technical guide, which we've now published. So the technical guide actually contains a couple of components. It also contains coding good practice, which I won't talk you through today, but for anyone who does code, we have some really helpful tips here on how to write your scripts and structure your scripts so that they're accessible for other people to work on and shareable to enable that good practice for the sector. But here I'm going to walk you through the DataViz style guide. So you may have seen this when we published it initially as a PDF. We actually felt that it would be really valuable to turn it into an interactive resource, because by doing so, we enable some further features that you just can't get out of the PDF. So we offer more depth on all of those principles that I've just walked through, like reducing the clutter here. We have some really specific points that you can think about. And due to the interactive nature, we also have features like this where you can toggle between the cluttered version of the chart and the tidy version of the chart. We have this for different principles, some examples of best practice. Here, what it looks like going from standard legend to the integrated legend. And again, for those who do code, we've designed this to be, you can use it with the tool of your choice, but for those who do code, you can choose to reveal the code, and everything that sits underneath these charts is available to you. So if you want to go away and create those same effects, you can see all of the code that's gone into creating something like that. And beyond those principles, we have another section on styling charts. So this was primarily made with TESO partners and staff in mind for formatting charts for our publications. But we hope it will be useful for the sector as well in terms of showing you how you might internally think about setting up your charts so that they're consistent across publications. So that includes things like deciding the font size, font type, how you want to use colors, how you want to format your images, And we also have some accessibility guidance on there as well. And we signposted some other resources. Hopefully, this guide will give you the vast majority of what you need to go away and start making good charts. But to create this, we use some really valuable resources that are going to give you a little bit extra if you want to go away and learn more about good data viz. We've got a collection here of some really helpful resources. So it will take us back to slide. The URL, we'll be sharing this after the webinar as well, but I do encourage you to go away and take a look, and hopefully it will be helpful for improving the quality of charts. So I'm just going to round up with some of the key takeaways from what I've discussed here today. Firstly, that charts aren't given enough attention, given the large impact that they can have. I don't think this is a unique problem to the sector, but I think it's somewhere where we can really see some big gains by thinking about the best way to visualize our data, particularly for busy decision makers and non-experts, how you can make this wealth of information more accessible to people. We discussed how this is relevant for APPs in particular, that call to make summaries that are accessible to non-experts and think about using how charts can be used to aid communication. We talked about how there's not a fixed way to do this. You want to take the principles, apply them in your own context, think about what works for you. There's always going to be limitations on creating charts, whether that's time or resources. And you want to think about kind of understanding you're trying to enable and who the audience is for a chart. And to do this, please do take a look at the TASO technical guide. It should be helpful. Hopefully we talk through all of these principles in more depth than we have time to cover today, with those interactive examples, and someone posted some really useful further resources as well. So with that, I think we will move on to questions.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Luke. So we do have some questions flowing in, and I'll try to, well, I'll get to as many of them as we can, and I'll group them where we can as well. So we're going to start with something that you talked a little bit about, but perhaps you could expand, which is a question around the recommendation of including titles in the that kind of describe the key takeaway or summary of the information that you're trying to present.
Yeah.
The question is, what if we have more than one key takeaway?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. You can have more than one key takeaway on a chart. If you really want to include an active title, I think it might be a case of thinking about what's the top takeaway. Just to bring home, if you could only bring home one key bit of information, what would it be? Or it may be the case that if you have multiple key takeaways, it could be better split into multiple charts, or even not using an active title if you want people to come to their own conclusions about what the key takeaway is. Often I think it's the case that we're including a chart because we have a key takeaway as authors. We have something in mind that we want people to take away from it, which is why we include it. So I think using an active title like that is going to depend on the context. There's going to be some more formal technical reports where you might not feel it's best to use an active title like that. But I think that's where we should be moving towards, is using more active titles. I think at first it was more publications like The Economist and more journalistic outlets that were using active titles. But I know that the ONS, even in recent years, have moved towards using active titles that summarize that key takeaway. So I guess my one sentence answer to the question was, think about if there's one key takeaway, what would it be, and use that on the title. and potentially use annotations as well to explore what some of those other key takeaways that were. I think that's what I did with the ethnicity degree awarding gap chart. Was I highlighted in the title that white students were getting a higher proportion of first and 2-1s than Black and minority ethnic students. But then in the chart, I highlighted that this gap was particularly stark between white students and Black students. So I guess that's an example of having 2 key takeaways where we sort of highlighted both of them. So you've got all of these different things to play around with. You've got annotations, highlighting the data, and the title. So if you can't squeeze all of your key takeaways into the title, think about if you can incorporate them into how you highlight the data and how you use annotations.
Lovely, thank you. Moving on to a slightly different question, Katie is asking, what are your thoughts on restricting the y-axis? Is this okay? And should you flag it if you do restrict the y-axis? And while you're thinking about a response to that, it reminds me of I think it was an Economist article that I read a number of years ago now, that I might try and dig out while you're giving an answer, Luke, that was talking about kind of when and why we should break the rules. And the reason it's reminded me is because I do think restricting the y-axis has been kind of hammered home as like a rule in the past, but there is good reasons to sometimes break them. So let me see if I can find that while you speak.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things are flexible. The one hard and fast rule is don't break the y-axis for bar charts. Bar charts should virtually always, I mean, there might be cases where they shouldn't, but I can't think of any. Bar charts should always start from 0. Other charts, I think, with a lot of the line charts I used, I didn't start from 0. I often think about what the plausible range is for something like that. So, for example, something like if you're showing free school meals, there's maybe not a need to go all the way up to 100% if you know that it's realistically never going to go over 10, 20%. Or similarly, if you're showing a line that's over 10 years has only ever stayed between 80 and 100%, don't feel like you need to start from 0. There's not really many rules in this apart from don't start a bar chart, always start a bar chart at 0 rather. I think as a rule of thumb, I also think about including space either side of the lines. I mean, my personal rule of thumb is that I try and leave about a third above the top line and a third below the bottom line, where you're looking at a narrow range, like 60 to 70%, all the data points fit in there. Maybe go 10% below that and 10% above that, so the lines aren't taking up the whole thing, because otherwise I guess that limits where it looks like things could go. Like it might look like you're already at the peak of possibilities at 70% when actually you could be going up to 80%. So yeah, not a lot of hard and fast rules, but it's potentially something we could integrate into the guide, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Just some reflections on what the rules are and where they might be.
Because we do have in there about don't start or always start your bar charts at 0. But beyond that, I don't think we have any rules on the y-axis.
Getting to the point where it's hard to just kind of choose between questions. So I'm going to try and take a couple quite quickly. One question that's just come through from an anonymous attendee is asking, are data point values necessary at all, or are they just clutter? And could we show them separately?
Is this in data labels, like in this example?
Yeah, I think that's what the question's asking, yes.
Yeah, so they can be clutter. Like I would say in another example where I viewed them as clutter, this one, where in this chart on the left where you're including every data point, I think that can be virginal clutter, because maybe that's something that I think charts aren't or shouldn't be intended to show everyone all of the data points. You're selectively presenting what you think the key information is. So I think if you if you think it's really essential for people in this case to see that, it was 3%, then 7%, 9%, maybe a table to go alongside the chart is better. And certainly where I have included those labels, like here where I've included 5 and 8%, as I say, it's sort of up to you in the context sense where you might think that the 5% and 8% are clutter because we've covered that in the title. So don't feel like you have to, definitely don't feel like you have to include data labels. I think it's a case of where you think they can add value, put them in, but be judicious and selected with it, because I wouldn't want people to take the annotate guidance and then be balance it with clutter, I guess, which I think the question was speaking to. So it's a good question. Yeah, I think balance those data labels with clutter and be intentional with what you're adding in.
Yeah, I agree. We've got a really interesting question. I wonder what your thoughts are, Luke, on so for colleagues who are used to using exploratory visuals, so thinking of the 3 E's, how can we get them to use explanatory visuals instead? So nudge them along the journey of those 3 E's.
Yeah, because I did see in the poll, I think Tableau was doing quite a lot of people are answering that. So I think a lot of people are used to producing exploratory ones. I guess I fall back on that framing of how would you present a chart if you were doing it verbally to someone. I think that's a really, really helpful bit of advice from Andy to think about. If you're not there to talk them through or you don't have the text alongside them, encourage people to think about, well, how would I communicate this if I was talking someone through it, and to put that on a static chart. I think in terms of convincing people to go from exploratory to explanatory, I guess I would emphasize that things like Excel it's really easy to add these bits of text in. So I think the barrier to entry is low to making good charts. And I guess I would also emphasize that sometimes these things do take a time investment up front to get used to making good charts. But I think in the long run, you get so much benefit from it, from making engaging explanatory charts, that it's worth putting the extra effort in. Because I think with exploratory, it can be a bit easy to lean on it as saying like, oh, well, I'll let people explore it for themselves. But oftentimes that's not really what you want. You want to convey a key takeaway to people. So I think you want to be considerate about using exploratory and not use it as like a default, particularly for anything that's external facing, I guess, because I know data dashboards and interactive things have a lot of really big value internally within teams. But yeah, a lot of the time I think there's big benefit to be had in terms of widening that audience in going from exploratory into explanatory. Hopefully that answers the question sufficiently. It is hard to convince people to go from one way of doing things to another, but I suppose that speaks to a bigger question.
Yeah, it does. I would just add a kind of comment on that, I guess, which is that as Luke has mentioned a couple of times, there seems to be a sort of default or a kind of status quo in terms of what we're used to, and not just in the higher education sector. I think the kind of data visualization as a piece of communication that Luke has talked through today is very familiar in the sort of data journalism world, but not in a lot of social sciences. I don't think we're alone in higher education in not making best use of these principles. So not that that's a kind of permission structure or a framework for us to rest easy, but I think it is currently the status quo. And I guess what we're trying to do today, and also generally by creating the technical guide and thinking about data visualization internally at Tazo, is shift all of us as a sector kind of along the journey to thinking about data as a communication tool. So we are going to continue to think about this and hopefully do more on sort of training and resources and help. So this question came from Keelan, help Keelan and his colleagues and the whole sector to move along that data viz journey. I'm going to take another question from Gavin. So Gavin's asking, how should you use active titles if the charts that we're using are interactive dashboards? A question around trade-offs, I guess.
So I think they're going to be less valuable for exploratory ones. I think the ONS talked about this a little bit, where they suggested that to get a similar effect, you could use a question. So rather than, if there's something where you're looking for people to explore in a certain way, maybe the active title could look something like a question that prompts them to think about how they would like to explore it. So rather than saying, I've seen some great ones where it'll say like, what are the income levels like in your area, or how have graduate levels changed in your area over time? And then you're prompting people in the same way that you might with an active title to explore with an angle. And I think things like that just create a bit of extra engagement rather than having that plain statistical subtitle that says, here's what the data is. You're prompting people to say, go and explore this great data dashboard that we have. So yeah, I think active titles in the sense of what we had there for one key takeaway aren't going to work in the same way, but a question could be a potentially good way of doing it. Or if you have the technical capabilities, I think something that's good sometimes is where the text updates. So where you have that sentence structure that says, in your area, there are X percentage of graduates. And then when you click the filters, it says, in Newcastle, there are X percentage of graduates. So I think that could be another option if you've got the technical capabilities for it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Luke. And then another question around kind of type of chart and the data that we're using. So a question asking how we know which type of chart is best to use given the data we have available to us.
Yeah, so there's a couple of really useful tools out there. The Financial Times have a visual vocabulary tool that we link to in the Data Viz Star Guide, where you can select the type of data that you have, and it will say, whether you're dealing with categories or continuous, and how many levels there are to the data, and it prompts you with different kind of charts that might be appropriate. I think you feel it out to an extent as well, the more that you make charts. I think when you first get into data viz, there's an impulse to use like all sorts of wacky different kinds of charts that people aren't familiar with, but realistically the bar chart and the line chart are indispensable as like really valuable, really familiar ways of people looking at data. So there definitely is a place for exploring different chart types there, because I think something that's not familiar might actually prompt people to stop and think, oh, what am I looking at here? Whereas if you're looking at a report with 20 line charts, you're going to start skimming over them at a point. So tool-wise, the visual vocabulary, which is in the guide, I think if you Google Financial Times visual vocabulary, it should be the first thing that comes up. That's a really useful one. And there's some equivalent tools that I can't remember off the top of my head for choosing charts in R as well. But I will update in the resources section of the Data Viz guide as I think of more options for choosing charts. Keeping an eye on things as well is a really good one. I mean, if you see like a really good way of visualizing the sort of data that you're working with, take a note of it and think, oh, can I apply that to my own chart? Because that really helped me to connect with the data in a way that I might not have with a bar chart or a line chart.
We have an internal thread on one of our kind of Teams chats at Tazo that is called DataViz, and there's always screenshots of various interesting and wacky charts in there that I do revisit when thinking about how to visualize data. So something like that
Yeah,
could be
because
a folder.
it's like anything else. I mean, you, as good as you think you are at whatever, there's always going to be people doing so many interesting things that you've just never thought of in incredible ways. So keep an eye out for where you see good data viz popping up, and go back to it. I mean, yeah, there's lots of good data viz out there if you know where to look. And our further resources section in the guide does signpost you to a lot of these places.
Luke, I'm going to give you one more question, but also a 60-second response time, if that's okay, because we are coming to the end of our time. So in a nice full circle moment, our last question is also about the idea of introducing titles to the chart. So this question is, by using titles that have a key takeaway, are you introducing a bias in any way for the reader?
I don't think so. I like to think of it as it's sort of an extension of what you would write. So I think if there's a key takeaway that you would throw your weight behind in the text and say, look, we think there's a big gap here between this group of students and that group of students. And that's, in the conclusions and the discussion and the introduction of your text. I don't see why you shouldn't show it in the same way visually to make it memorable and engaging. And I think it's the same with writing, where if you're being faithful to what the data says and you're accurately representing it, then I don't think it really does introduce a bias. So just, if you're being honest, as people generally are, and communicating what your key takeaway is from the text through a title, I think that's only a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I guess to add one more thing, the data is normally still sitting there for people to unpick. So if they read the title and they think that doesn't actually line up with what's in front of me, if you said there's a big increase and people can see there's a flat line, they're going to pick that apart, and they're going to see for themselves that that's just not true. So yeah, just take it as you would with writing, and if you've got a key takeaway that you're happy to stand behind in your text, stand behind it in your chart as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to wrap us up there because we are at time. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's our kind of official launch of the technical guides that Luke quickly walks you through. And as he has alluded to in many of his question responses, we are going to keep updating that and hope to grow it as a resource over time as people continue to submit and develop their APPs, but then also communicate those APPs over the next APP cycle, the next kind of 3 to 5 years. So yeah, big thank you to everyone for joining, and a big thank you, Luke, for presenting and sharing all of that information with us. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.